Cool. Seems we are live recording on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn right now, and we have one host, one person joining so far here in Riverside. Well, but we can start. Um, so, welcome in the first live stream of How to DAO, which we are doing in cooperation with Network State Connect, which is the platform who is trying to build more education around network states, DAOs, and crypto at large. Our first guest here, it's Josh, the founder of President DAO, and we will give him some time to present himself and the President DAO. And the co-host of the Spaces is Gideon, who is also the co-teacher of the How to DAO course with myself. So welcome, Gideon.
Awesome to be here. Great to see
Cool.
you guys.
Yeah, I'm excited for this first Spaces and how it goes, and if it's actually on YouTube and Twitter because I never done it before, but we will see. It's recorded, so we will be published on YouTube anyway after that. But now, apart from my technical jokes, Josh, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks a lot for having me. Pleasure to join your course and be a part of the DAO movement that you've been a leader of. So I guess the reason, yeah, exactly, a big fan of your book. Got to read the pre-release. So I guess the reason I'm here, I started President DAO several months ago, but we've yet to launch. I was kind of influenced. I grew up, I'm an American, and growing up as a child in New York and California, I was definitely heavily influenced by kind of liberal politics. But later in my life, serving in the military, I would say more of my friends and close relationships lean more towards the right. And over the last election cycle, I got to speak to people on both sides of the aisle. And I was really struck by how divisive the political landscape had become in the US. And this is something, that is not novel that I've come up with, but a lot of people have really pointed to the fact that politics in the US has really gotten bifurcated. And we're kind of forced into this weird situation where we have to pick between someone who represents all of us on the left and someone who represents all of our decisions on the right. And it's a little bit silly, especially when you look at what's going on elsewhere in the world, particularly, let's say, in Europe, where you have this great diversity of parties and decisions that you can make, and not just, feel the need to identify with one of these tribes. And so a few months ago, we started talking about this idea of what if we could use the DAO as this coordination mechanism to start an independent party. And obviously, there are several other independent parties in the US, but really none of them have grasped the attention, I think, of a wide enough audience. And they all kind of pitch this idea of being part of this big tent where they want all the independent people to come be a part of them. But they don't really have a great coordination mechanism to say to all these disparate groups, hey, how could we work together and game theory this thing and actually figure out a way to insert ourselves into the conversation? And until someone does that, we're really stuck in this two-party paradigm. So I got really excited about DAOs because they're this fascinating coordination tool where we can suddenly kind of all get on the same page very quickly. And I'm sure over the next hour, we'll talk about some examples of how different groups have done that. I definitely want to talk about Constitution DAO as one of them, but I think we've never been in a position where we have the technology to coordinate this quickly and this powerfully. So I'm really excited to be with you two guys who are both kind of experts on the technology, where I'm just educating myself on how best we can use it.
Nice. Thank you for the introduction. And I'm always happy to hear like if someone is solving like really big problems. Not just like little niche somewhere, but like trying to change the world in a sense. Because if you are changing U.S. politics, you are kind of changing like part of the world in that sense. And you said like you were inspired by European politics. I think I'm actually more familiar with the European politics than United States politics, even though I live in the United States, but I spend most of my time in Europe. And, you know, it's not silver bullet either to have
Sure.
so many parties because like I can see it like in Czech Republic, like there are new parties basically every election cycle. They get like 10, 20%, and the next cycle they are gone or rebranded and merged and things. And it's also a little messy. But like, I get your point. Like what I feel in US, it's like you kind of need to be part of one camp. Like you need to be blue or red. There's nothing
Right.
in between. And it's not even about what they are trying to achieve on the policy level or something like that. It's more about even like a social pressure type of things. Like I'm here in San Francisco, like people would be afraid to speak up if they are part of the red team, because it's like a lot of blue pressure here, and you will have probably very different story in some of the rural areas. So, it's great that you are bringing some novelty to it. Maybe let's start like what have you already done? Like how you think like you can actually get from the zero, like starting the president now, to some like actually starting like getting some traction and being able to change the vibe that people will start thinking I don't need to be blue or red. Like like I can actually kind of be myself and say what I want, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think what I'm strategizing is taking lead from the people who are already leading the discussion. So if you look at Elon Musk, for example, he's already taken to Twitter to say, "Hey, let's do a poll and ask the American people what they think." He did it recently with certain appointments for the upcoming, presidential appointments, and I think he's got the right idea, right? The concept of right now we're only asking the American people to speak once every 4 years in terms of federal election, and they're only doing an election. They're not doing a referendum. They're not voting on any of the issues. So what Elon is trying to do when he puts a poll out on X is say, hey, let's actually talk about one of these issues and get the people to talk about it. And this is something that's like entirely changing the paradigm of how American politics have been working for the last 40 years. We've only been talking about people and electing representatives. We've spent very little of our time as American citizens actually participating in issues. And I think that's where the discussion is going to start to move, is towards how do we talk about specific issues. And I think a DAO is a perfect tool for, how do we vote on a specific issue, and also not just vote, but how do we actually discuss and have intellectual conversation about these issues? Can somebody put forth a proposal, and can other people argue either for or against it? And then can we vote on kind of those opinions regarding those issues? We don't need to necessarily pick a person right out of the gate.
Right.
So I think what we're trying to do with President Dow is let's start off by voting on some of these very easy topics that it's kind of easy for all of us to talk about. I think a great example would be senators voting, senators trading stocks. So in the US, right, senators can pick stocks. They can get basically what amounts to insider information in their daily activities as a senator. They can call up their stockbroker and say, hey, I want to buy or sell this stock. And the American public doesn't know about it until 14 days later. Now, even just trading on that information 14 days later, you're going to well outperform the markets. And we see that the Nancy Pelosi model, right, is up 50%, I think, this year, competing only with the inverse Jim Cramer, which I think is hilarious because I've hated that guy forever. So,
Yeah.
but we could take an example like that. Like, for example, as a poll, do you think senators should be able to trade on the information gleaned from their activities as a senator? And I think whether you're Republican, Democrat, or independent, we can all kind of agree that no, you shouldn't really be able to do that. I could even make the case that perhaps our adversaries abroad could glean information from those trades, even 14 days later, to get inside information about potential national security issues. So these are the types of topics that I think whether, no matter what side of the spectrum you lean on politically, we can all kind of agree on. Another one would be, for example, compensation for Supreme Court justices. I think we all agree that those guys should be well paid by our tax dollars, but we can all agree that they shouldn't be getting, let's say, little perks from vested interests. When Clarence Thomas comes out and says, hey, my kid's tuition was paid for by this donor. I went on jet trips or yacht trips from this donor. I think we can all agree that that's a little bit ridiculous, and our Supreme Court justices should be free from that undue influence. And it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, totally. And like, I like the point you mentioned at the beginning. Like, let people to be part of the discourse. Like, this is not like thing which is decided somewhere else. This is something what we should be deciding because it's influenced us people the most. And I totally agree with you. Like, there is not enough incentives or like even opportunities. Like, I don't think I can participate in those decisions, therefore I don't. Like, that's kind of how I feel everyone here in the United States. And for that sake, Czech Republic, it's not very different. We also kind of have this election every 4 years. We complain a lot about politicians in like pubs and other uh, like similar type of establishments. However, we are not going to submit a proposal, or we don't have the opportunity to vote in referendums. Like, I think in my 30 years of life, I think there was like three referendums I remember. Joining NATO was one, which was in 90s, and then joining European Union was second, and leaving European Union was third. So like, that's kind of like, okay, this is like big decision, so probably we should all vote on it. But other than that, we really don't have. But I like this example of other European countries, and I was there actually this summer in like Switzerland, where people are actually empowered to vote. And when I was talking to the locals, I was like, how people can this like even think about the like the policies, like, because in Czech Republic we don't have the context. Like, if you just give people like, hey, should the budget be this way or that way, should we do this or that, they will be like, I don't know. However, you can teach people to do it. Like, those people still visit this establishment like pubs. However, their discussion, it's not about football. Their discussion is on the next like vote they need to go through, and like what are the other opinions, and they like really prepared well for the people to get informed and vote for it. So, well, my question is like, have you maybe like also like got inspired by some of the direct democracies which are already existing for the president now? Is that something like where are you looking at?
Yeah, definitely. Great question. And I think we could point to Switzerland as probably the closest example we have on the planet Earth of democracy that looks like what a DAO would be in practice. So, for those who don't know, in Switzerland, you have kind of this mix of representative democracy like we have in the US and a touch of direct democracy, which is kind of what I'm proposing with President DAO. Now, for those of you in America who kind of might dismiss this as some European shenanigans, I would highlight the fact that the Swiss Constitution was taken directly from the American Constitution. So the Swiss Constitution was passed in 1848, and they had a keen eye on the success that they had already seen occur in the States. So much so that they even have a bicameral legislature. And for those of you Americans, this will sound really familiar. One house is based on your population, and one house, the representation is based on two per canton or state. So they literally took the American Constitution pretty much word for word and started there. But they had one really key important change that we don't have in the States, which is this little tiny control mechanism of decentralization. And what they did was they said, for certain topics, we must ask the people for their vote. And there are three topics that they must ask the people for in Switzerland. One is anything that is an amendment to the Constitution. One is anything that would be a supranational vote, like you mentioned, Punkar. Should we join the EU? Should we join NATO? Should we leave either of those bodies? And then the third would be if there's any urgent issue, let's say that the government takes, maybe around national security, that's fine, they can do that. But if they're going to keep it on the books for more than a year, it has to go to the people to decide if that should stay. And so that would be relevant, for example, in the US, we passed the Patriot Act right after September 11th, which kind of gave the defense intelligence agencies an ability to kind of snoop a little bit on the US population. And that was kind of everyone was okay with that for a little period of time. But in hindsight, we probably, didn't want to keep that on the books permanently, and that would be something that would be put to the people in Switzerland. And so what that has done is actually it's like really influenced the political bodies, even though they have this centralized power, they have to think in the back of their head, hey, if we pass this law, are the people going to try to vote and get a referendum passed on this? And the mechanism by which they do that is any citizen, literally anyone in Switzerland, can try to submit a proposal to challenge one of the new laws. All they need is 100,000 signatures. And so for Switzerland, I think they have about 4 or 5 million voters. So by comparison, US ratio, maybe this would be like saying we need a couple million signatures and you could put anything to a vote. So when lawmakers are actually making a law, they have to think to themselves, hey, how is this going to look to a small percentage of our population? Because if there's a large percentage that actually would not like this, it's going to get struck down. And we're going to do all this work. And then within the 100 days that the people have to vote against it, they're going to vote it down and we're going to look like idiots and we're probably going to lose our positions of power. We don't have that mechanism in the States. Once we elect someone, they're good to go for 4 years, 6 years, or in the case of the Supreme Court, for life. There is no mechanism by which we can recall them, right? Maybe the president in impeachment, but even a U.S. citizen can't suggest that. So I think that's a really key piece is that the Swiss, politicians, even back in 1848, realized if we put a little bit of decentralization in here, it's really going to make everything turn out better. And that's what we're trying to do with President DAO is just introduce a slight parallel spin of decentralization and see what happens.
And so, Josh, just out of curiosity, am I correct that certain US states do have this kind of popular check on policy by having these referendums or proposals or props as a mechanism, right? So is it already in place on the state level?
On the state level, yes, some states do have this mechanism, some more than others. But if you look at a lot of the referenda that came up in this last election, a lot of them were actually taking back the rights of citizens to either recall judges, recall sheriffs, or have votes on things. Take Nevada, for example. If you want to pass a referendum in Nevada, you have to actually pass it twice. You've got to get 50% of people to vote on it this year, and then it's going to come up again in 2 years, and you've got to get 50% of people to vote on it again. So the political bodies have really stacked the cards against our favor as people, as citizens, to try to pass things. In Florida, you need a super majority, right? You need 60% plus. And I think that came into play on a couple of their items this year as well.
Hey, and so another question here is like, there's voting on issues and there's voting on basically politicians, right? So, and the second option is obviously a way more personal thing, right? You're trusting a politician with their charm and personality and character to represent you in a certain way. Right, so in a way it's public trust in a character, right? So I'm also thinking of approval scores and all that type of stuff. All that is tied to personal participation in politics, right? So in a way the old adage of all politics is personal, in a way, this is a different twist on that, which is to say we have politicians that we trust and we vote them as persons into office. Now you contrast that to we might have certain opinions on the issues, and that should have a larger weight, so to say, right? That's a more pure discussion. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong, right? If that is correct. The second question here is, if that is so, right? So if the personal aspect, if we want to diminish that a bit, how do we do that in a political world in which politicians have become more and more prominent in a way, right? Some are even saying that we're in this new phase of almost autocratic regimes in which there is ever more trust, or at least ever more longing for a strongman, for example, right? So how do we balance these like tendencies of people to trust people and kind of go back to the actual issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I mean, in the late 1700s, when we set up representative democracy in the US, we needed people to represent us. because me as a landowner in
Yeah.
Maine or Virginia, I couldn't ride my horse into Philadelphia or Boston for every single vote. It would take me 2 weeks just to get there. And certainly not everyone is going to be able to ride their horse into that city and make the vote. So we needed people to be our representatives. And maybe let's say if I was a landowner, if I was a farm owner, I would elect a guy who I knew was also a farm owner because I knew we would have similar interests. Fast forward 250 years, we don't have that same issue. We're not reliant upon horses to send our message into Washington. We could vote on everything directly. The only reason I think that we don't is because we live in a system that was established 250 years ago.
Right.
Now, how do we correct that? To answer part two of your question. So the first most logical way would be by amendments, right? So in Switzerland, for example, where I've discussed, it's pretty easy to bring up an amendment. Between 1848 and 1973, Switzerland had 140 amendments to the Constitution that were passed. Basically, what ended up happening was they had like a Wikipedia entry for their Constitution. That's how often it was edited. And what was the result of that? Well, it wasn't perfect. It ended up being kind of a mishmash. It was kind of incomprehensible. There were pieces of it that contradicted other pieces of it. So in 1973, the politicians said, hey, we got to clean this stuff up. They spent 20 years cleaning it up. And then in 93, they voted on the cleaned up version. And the people said, yes, we agree that you've cleaned it up in the way that we intended it to be cleaned up. This is good to go. Let's compare that with the American system of amendments. The last American amendment to the Constitution, the 27th Amendment, was passed in 1992. That was a 200-year-old proposal that finally passed. And what did that amendment do? It guaranteed the salary of our representatives for the duration of their term. So it said, basically, as American citizens, we can't dock their salary for doing stuff that we disagree with. That's the culmination of our amendments for the last 50 years. Because the one before that was in 1971, the 26th Amendment, and all that did was lower the voting age to 18. So basically, for the last 53 years, while we've gone from black and white televisions to DAOs, the American Constitution has sit totally unchanged.
Right.
Now, on the one hand, that's a testament to what a beautiful God-given document that is. Like, these guys freaking almost nailed it, that it is so good that we rarely ever need to change it. On the other hand, guys, sometimes we might need to change it. That's what we're trying to say here.
Well, I'm happy that like we increase the job security in the United States, At least some people are guaranteed their salary if others are not. So
Exactly.
that's cool. But like, yeah, I agree. Like now we have way different tools before than we had before. And like even without blockchain, we still like can be very digital and there is like remote voting and like on the personal level, if we are voting on something or discussing something, we do it on the digital front. Like we go to X to discuss issues, or we have like group chats with friends if we want to discuss like what we will be doing next weekend. And it's immediate. We don't need like, big period of times or like too much time to spend on it. It's just like, this is my opinion and I would like to, contribute to the discussion. So I agree we should probably adjust based on the tools we have available. And we already mentioned like you choose like a DAO as a tool. And I think it's great because DAOs are the way to have more direct democracy in organizations. And it doesn't need to be organization like for profit, like a business. It can be also, political movement. It can be political party being on chain. And I think one thing which we also can do is like if we learn something what works in United States or other countries, we can replicate it very easily because everything is very transparent, and we can basically redo the same maybe in bigger scale or smaller scale and test it out. And there is not that much, I would say, risk involved on the technical level.
Exactly.
So in terms of tools, were you already thinking of like how you would be like engaging basically with the population? Because I know like the DAO as an organization structure, but when we are thinking like, okay, how we can like actually implement it into the system, what is the like first step to get like the small little adoption and people have access to it? Because the other part of it, it's like it needs to be accessible to everyone, because if it's not accessible to everyone, uh like that's also not great, or it's really bad actually in like the political sense. So maybe let's start with that question. How you are making sure that this will be kind of accessible to all people in United States?
Exactly. Yeah, you bring up a great point, and I think that's the first question someone should ask when they hear about a DAO as a political party. Is obviously right now this is kind of only accessible to people who are familiar with Web3, people who have maybe had a crypto wallet in the past, and things like that. But I would say that on the counter, the tools that are being developed in the Web3 community are evolving incredibly rapidly. We're already at the point where simply with an email address, you can set up a wallet basically without even knowing that you're setting up a wallet, right? You log in, you type in your email address, and I would say probably within the next couple of years, you can probably just use your cell phone, and with your phone number and 2FA, you can reliably have a crypto address that's tied to your person, and that can be what you use to vote in something like this DAO. What's interesting also to me is that I don't think we need to have 100% adoption or participation in a DAO to, let's say, win an election. In fact, if you look at the numbers, in the U.S. we have around 66% voter turnout on a given election. Right now, about 50% of Americans, which is an all-time high, are saying that they're classifying themselves as independents, right? Which means then you have about 25% who classify themselves as Republicans and 25% as Democrats. I've done the game theory on this. You only need about 1/5 of each of those groups in order to put someone in the White House. You need 1/5 of independents, you need 1/5 of Republicans, and you need 1/5 of Democrats. And what you can do with the DAO is actually incentivize some of these really interesting things. For example, could we get a Republican and a Democrat to kind of link up and say, hey, we're both going to leave this two-party system that we don't really believe in, and we're going to participate in this DAO. And so I think we can all agree that out of the friends that we know who are Republicans or Democrats, we could pick 1 out of 5 of them who would be willing to participate in a DAO, especially if all they need to do is text something using their phone number. So that's really what we're trying to do with President DAO. I think in the early days, it's going to be a bit Web3 heavy, and it's going to rely on participants and developers who are really savvy in this industry. But really within the first few months, I would like to get this to the point where someone can join simply by texting. They can vote simply by texting. They can verify their identity simply by texting. And you have a lot of great projects going on that are trying to basically solve this issue of, can we, with a high degree of certainty, verify that someone is a human, or particularly that they're an American human. And I would point to, for example, WorldCoin is probably the example that's farthest along in this challenge. And so for anyone who's listening out there who's kind of heard about WorldCoin from maybe some headlines from mainstream media, there's this really strong willingness from the mainstream media to say, hey, this is a crazy project because they want to take a picture of your retina, which is like totally what we know to be in sci-fi novels, the thing that is going to make us susceptible to government intrusion, XYZ. But if you actually push beyond that and get into the nuance and understand a bit about how these blockchain mechanisms work, you see that groups like WorldCoin and a few others out there that are trying to solve this humanity issue, they're really doing an incredibly important work. And I think the tools that they pump out in the next few years are going to be very important for projects like President DAO.
Awesome. And Josh, what would be oh wow, I think our friend Punkar cut off. What would be at least what does your roadmap look like more or less, right? So what are the bigger goals that you'd love to work on with President DAO, and what is some intermediate milestone or smaller goal that you would be happy with to achieve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously, it sounds a bit crazy to shoot for the moon and go straight for the White House. But I think what's important about doing that is it brings attention to the cause, and I think will bring a lot of interest to this movement. But in terms of practical sense, I think we can look to other groups that are having success already at the local level. And probably the one that's having the most success is goodparty.org. So this is a group that's essentially built the software tools, they've bought the voter data, and they're doing everything they can to support independent candidates. And in 2024, they actually had over 3,000 candidates win elections at the local and state level. So this is everything from school boards, local countywide elections, all the way up to statewide. And I think they had 900 candidates win in the state of Minnesota. So it's kind of that's kind of the origin of it. But what they've done is essentially say, hey, if you were to be a Democrat or Republican, you would be given all these tools as kind of like your onboarding package, and this would help you win your local elections. Well, let's try to level the playing field a bit and put all those tools together so that if you're an independent John Doe, you can actually run with the same benefits that someone would get if they were running for one of those parties. And so I think that's what we'll probably realistically look to do with President Dow is in 2026, try to win some local and state level elections using DAOs to empower candidates to go into election and say, hey, I'm not running on any platform. So I don't have anything that you can hit me on. I'm not green. I'm not libertarian. I'm not left. I'm not right. I literally just think that we should vote on things.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really hard thing for people to criticize, especially when you see kind of how the tribal politics have turned out in the US. To the ability to just walk into an election and say, hey, I've got this phone, and on this phone, I have 80% of voters in our district, and any question you have, I'm not going to have an opinion on it. I'm going to go to the voters and see what they say. I think that's an incredibly powerful tool, and I think voters will respond to that.
Yeah, so maybe a little. So I have a lot of experience with politics of the Netherlands, right? So there was a political party 10 years ago which basically said, we are just if you elect us into government, into national government in the House of Representatives, we will be your so-called voting machine. So we will be there as actual people, but whatever you tell us to do, we will do. And every proposal that is being put forward in the national government, we will forward it to you on the internet, and you'll be able to comment, and we will kind of decide together what to vote on this proposal. And whatever the internet decides, or our members decide on the internet, whatever we will vote for. So it had the backing of a pretty big Dutch website, basically, a news website. So it did gain some attention and some traction. And of course, one of the questions that they asked of those politicians that were on that list was like, but really, doesn't it really matter who you are, or what you did, or what your track record is? They found some interesting things in their personal histories, and the journalists started kind of picking at that. So it was kind of a hard sell for some of these politicians to say, hey, listen, I'm actually not a politician. I'm just going to sit there in parliament and do whatever you guys want me to do.
Yeah.
So that was, and eventually they didn't get into parliament. So there was an effort like that. And then, if I kind of do the post-mortem, like, why didn't that work? It's probably because that messaging was a bit too complex. Like, okay, we'll actually go to parliament for you guys, but then, we'll see you guys later to discuss things. Apparently that didn't speak to enough people, right? So how do we get around that problem in the US or with the DAO or however you want to do it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, maybe they were actually just maybe a little early for their time, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of talk these days, especially in the US, about the Overton window. Are you guys familiar with that one? Right. So taking issues and talking about things that at one point were either unthinkable or radical, now have they moved more into the mainstream to the point where they're acceptable, sensible, and eventually will be popular and then policy. And I think we see in the US that window has shifted extremely rapidly in the last month to the point where, like I mentioned, Elon is talking about actions he's going to take in government while he's just a private citizen, and he's taking votes on his own social media platform. But in some way, that's kind of representing, in theory, a vote of the people. And I think, I would look as a parallel to what we've seen with Bitcoin. 10 years ago or so, when I got into Bitcoin, this was not a thing that was generally accepted as popular or would ever be part of policy. It was something that was a bit radical. It was fake internet money. And it was basically, you should only invest in it what you're willing to fully lose 100%, right? But I would ask you to maybe fast forward in your mind to when you're talking to your grandkids around the fire someday, and you're telling them about how back in your day you used to use little pieces of paper wherever you went to buy things. And if you crossed a border, you'd have to exchange your pieces of paper for the other guy's pieces of paper at a ratio that was always kind of changing to buy things in their country. And your grandkids will laugh at you in the face because they'll say, well, why wouldn't you be using Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever they're using 80 years from now? I'm sure it's something we have no idea what it will be, but I can guarantee you that it won't be either bars of gold bullion or pieces of paper. I'm sure about those two things. And I think in the same way, if we're to fast forward maybe just 20 or 30 years, if you're running an election, you're going to have to justify the reason why you're not using blockchain in that election and in that voting process. Whereas today, I think that's a radical idea, and people will say, oh, you'd be crazy because this is subject to manipulation, yada, yada. But those of us who've worked in the space for quite a bit know that actually blockchain is an extremely elegant solution to some of these voting issues. And in the States, we kind of see this all as a very hypothetical or theoretical issue, right? We kind of have generally, I hope, a trust in our voting machines, our voting mechanisms, although even in the US, we've seen that become a point of contention. But I would point to other countries like Romania, for example. Just last week, the Supreme Court had to invalidate the results of their election because of extreme suspicion of Russian interference with the voting mechanism. And I think right now, like, it's kind of crazy to think in 20 years from now, it'll be crazy to look back and think we were trusting individual companies to manage our elections and our voting systems. I think when we look back, we'll say blockchain was such an obvious answer. We had it in our back pocket. Why weren't we using it? And I think it's okay that we're not using it right now. But I do think very rapidly you're going to see countries, particularly maybe El Salvador might be the first to start saying, hey, we're going to put all our elections on the blockchain. That way there's really no way that people can say that there's been interference when everyone can go on their own home computer and check out what the voting was.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Like the kind of censorship resistancy and like not any single source or individual or company or state be able to actually manipulate the results is super important. Because otherwise nobody will trust the system. Yep. And I think like what blockchain can really bring, it's like this kind of sovereignty of the system itself. Like I think like you mentioned Elon before, with the poll, and like, he's asking people what he should do. And then he might do it or not. So I think there is like this like thing, it's like twofold. One is the, platform that actually the results will be accurate. And the second is kind of the execution that you actually follow through on it. I think Twitter is doing pretty good job on even though they are not on blockchain, but they are fairly open source with the community nodes. So if there is something false or something is changing, it kind of get revealed. Still not perfect. I think they will be better off if they actually not just open source it, but put it, on decentralized network, so we can check that all the entries were like legit and there was no manipulation with it. But then like we are also getting to the execution phase. Like, okay, we will be voting on issues or stuff. Did you think like how we can ensure that like it will follow through? That like, do you think like a regulation needs to change? Do you think like we need more like, if the DAO will be deciding or something what is on chain, it's actually like, legit kind of law? Or like how you are thinking about the other problem? Like now we are getting everything like legit, but now how we kind of start executing on it?
Exactly, yeah. So in doing a lot of thinking about this, I think it's kind of unrealistic for us to believe that we're gonna, let's say, use a lobby to lobby the US government to make a significant change to how decisions are made. We've made attempts at this, Lobby 3 DAO, for example, Andrew Yang's project a few years ago. And then obviously there's cryptocurrency lobbies, but it's pretty unrealistic, and it's going to be a pretty slow process for us to try to say to leaders of either the Democratic or Republican Party, hey, we've got this great idea, just trust us, let us run with it, and let's see what happens. Maybe you could say under this administration some crazy ideas might be more plausible, but in reality, I think what's the better opportunity for us is to demonstrate the power and the speed with which we can coordinate in a DAO by actually doing it. Let's run it in parallel. Let's nominate someone to represent us, and let's empower them to run an election. And if they win, and probably this is exactly what happened in Netherlands as well, although they didn't make it to parliament, those people are going to be extremely empowered to actually continue doing what they said they would do, which is listen to the DAO or the people who are behind them voting. I find it, very hard to believe that that candidate who we put into office is then suddenly going to say, "Okay, thanks for getting me here, guys. All right, now I'm taking off my hat and I'm actually a Republican in disguise. Gotcha."
Yeah, and my salary is guaranteed, so you cannot change that.
Exactly. Yeah. That's certainly a possible outcome. I'm not denying that, but I think if we can actually run this system in parallel and kind of demonstrate the power of it, that's where we'll have the best success. If you look at Constitution DAO, which I'm remiss that it took me 40 minutes to get back to this in this call, but Constitution DAO, for those who aren't familiar, these guys raised about $40 million to try to buy a copy of the Constitution. Kind of as a symbolic gesture, right? But not only symbolic, but also that everyone who participated would actually own a share of that actual authentic copy of the Constitution. They were, of course, beat in the Sotheby's auction by Ken Griffin, kind of the enemy of the people in that case, who ultimately was forced to pay over $40 million for this copy, which he probably otherwise would have only paid about $20 million for. The money actually all went to charity. So that DAO, you could actually say, had a concrete impact of raising $20 million for charity. Now, here's the fact about them that shocked me. How long do you think it was between when they floated this idea out into the ether and when they had $40 million in their account? It was 7 days. 7 days. So the fact that they were able to crowdsource that funding from thousands of people really just proves how quickly people can coordinate with this mechanism. So that's why I'm excited. We're sitting here in 2024 talking about an election in 2028. For a traditional political party, that is tomorrow, right? Both sides are already planning on what they're going to be doing in 2028. As a DAO, I'm sitting here drinking wine because I know that we can coordinate so much faster that 4 years is an eternity, right?
Right.
And so that's, I think, where we're at right now.
And so on the topic of speed, I really love this one because obviously, like, online collaboration has the potential to be lightning fast, right? And as you said, Josh, there's no more need to have a representative go on horseback to a city capital or to a state capital. I think that's also encapsulated in a way by the word liquid democracy, right? It can be ever fluent, ever changing, and you can at any moment almost participate. Now, how do you kind of balance this speed with the, let's say, slowness and maybe even required long-term thinking for certain policy fields, right? So one of the complaints in some countries is, hey, we had all these green subsidies and now suddenly they're being taken back and they're being reintroduced in certain cases. The US has seen this, for example, and then, they look over to China and say, hey, wait a minute, they have a actual long-term 10, 20, 30-year policy to keep these subsidies in place until these industries are really mature, and only then, they might reconsider, right? So this kind of long-term thinking, how do you prevent that long-term thinking from being hijacked by, let's say, the eventualities and the emotions of the people at a certain moment?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and certainly we haven't figured out the answers to all of these. But I would say that right now, we can kind of go one in two ways as Americans. We can go in the way of China, where there's an extremely centralized government who's saying this is not only our 10-year plan, this is our 100-year plan, this is our 500-year plan, right? Which is what they're doing, and honestly, that works. That works. A funny story I just actually saw yesterday was around the World Cup, because you guys probably saw that Saudi Arabia got the 2034 World Cup, somewhat controversially. But the author of this article pointed back to 2018 when Brazil was kind of having some issues getting the stadiums ready and things like that. and the Secretary General of FIFA said the quiet thing out loud, and he said, you know, actually, democracies are not necessarily great for setting up World Cups.
There you
Which is
go.
true. Which is true.
Yeah.
If you have a dictator who can say, "Hey, we're going to commit to maybe killing 1,000 migrant workers, but as a result, we're going to have a beautiful stadium ready in record time," that's one way to handle things. What we're proposing with President Dow is let's try to go to the other end of the spectrum and let's see if we can solve some of these issues together as a DAO. Now, just because it's quick decision making doesn't necessarily mean it has to be rash, right? If every decision of the DAO is meant to be made with this vision for the 4, 8, 12-year horizon, then it's perfectly reasonable to believe that we could install some guardrails such that things, for example, that are incentivizing business investment, especially in infrastructure, right? Projects that might take 5, 10, 20 years to develop, should have guardrails such that we can't necessarily vote on them today and then vote on them again tomorrow. So I totally understand your point, and I think it's certainly within our ability as thinking, civilized human citizens to figure out a solution to some of these issues.
And
Yeah,
maybe
so
the
from
same.
just like a note, and then Gideon, you can have a question. Just a note on the like 5-year, 10-year planning. I was born into socialist country, so Czech Republic was into like this planning economy. Well, I don't think it works. So there is like how you decide from top basically that this will be needed within 5 years, including like food consumption. Like you don't even know how much people will eat, what they will like, and stuff like that. So I'm definitely way more inclined to like your approach, Josh, what you are doing with President now. Like, let's not be rushed, but let's like check what we need at different times, because like it might be changing, it might be evolving. I don't know what I will be doing over weekend, how I can plan for 5 years.
Right, right. And look, what's beautiful about smart contracts is we can say without a doubt, hey, for example, let's lock up this funding for a certain amount of time and let's make this funding available to whoever accomplishes this goal, build a bridge, build a road, whatever it may be. And there's no doubt that a politician or a human can get in the way. If we've set up the system properly, that money will still be there in 10 years. Hopefully the value of Ethereum or Bitcoin or whatever currency we decide to use, maybe it's USDT, is still there in 10 years. But as long as that's there, then the bounty will still be there for whoever needs to make this public good.
Yeah, I totally agree. And with the pace of innovation, like we don't really know what will be next year. Like now, and you've been visiting in San Francisco, like we have autonomous cars as taxis. And like, it changed a lot of things, how we are actually thinking about transportation or even car ownership for that sake, because now there is a car that can basically work 24/7 for everyone who needs it at that point in time. So like now, like how we are actually thinking, in the future of like car industry, because car ownership might be getting like lower and lower because it's just not efficient, and we just don't need it anymore. So like, yeah, like this is not just like I would say from people perspective, but DAO can also solve for this like big changes in the technological advancement, because now we are bringing the experts in the DAO, and they can actually help us to guide us through this future. And also like those people who used to be taxi drivers, and let's say in 10 years there is no taxi driver as a job because every car is autonomous. Like how we can help them to get the next job they need. And I think this like conversation and like openness and like being very transparent about the needs of the population, and giving the help through some courses or other means, like I think that moves us as a society to be way better. So again, like really appreciating what you are doing with the president now. Gideon, I think we have like time for one more question. We have like 10 minutes, and then we need to start wrapping up. So do you have anything to ask?
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting question, and this might be further down the road, but how do you work with those, let's say, classically countervailing powers? And there's two that comes to mind, right? So there's the judiciary, and there's the civil service, and both are kind of professional classes of which we expect to have a certain judgment that goes beyond immediate politics, right? And I know both have been controversial, right? So in the US, I believe now with the new administration coming in, there's plans to politicize the civil service further. Obviously, the way it's arranged in the US, the politicians have a quite some influence on who is on the judicial side as well. Um, there's also people saying, hey, you know what? That's actually more democratic, right? So if through democracy we vote a certain political party into power, they should be able to also control to a certain extent the judiciary and the civil service. In a country like Israel, for example, where they have put forward these proposals to kind of gut the Supreme Court a bit, you know, some people say, hey, that's pro-democracy, and others say, hey, we're losing a countervailing power there that can think a layer deeper and maybe have more insights into the real complexities, right? So these two powers, do you think that ultimately those should be gutted as well and just become subservient to the DAO? Or do you think it's actually, in a way, useful to have them as kind of a check on whatever politics of that day is dictating?
Yeah, that's a great question, and two very important fields. I'll start with the civil service because I think that's the easier one. I would say actually right now, you know, at least the stated goal of Doge and the incoming administration is not to politicize the civil service. Whether or not that's true or not remains to be seen. We'll find out. But I think, you know, certainly they have an interesting tactic, which is let's try to eliminate as much of the bureaucracy as we can. And I do have to say, even as a service member in our armed forces, I saw a lot of the bureaucracy that really kind of slows us down, at least on the administrative side. Not necessarily on the tactical side, but on the administrative side, I think we are extremely slow. So I do hope that they get rid of a lot of that. Now, I think they're probably going to swing the pendulum probably way too far, as is the case with Elon, as he's admitted to with his companies, on the side of firing too many people. Right, we're going to find out what are those civil service jobs that are actually really critical to the functioning of the U.S. Right, and I think that's important because those people are going to come back with a vengeance and say, "Look what breaks down. Look at the shit that breaks down if we're not sitting doing our job." And I think that's really important because that's going to empower those people to actually have a really vocal role in what happens over the next 4 years. But I think there's also a really sweet opportunity for something like a DAO in 4 years from now, after kind of all this chaos is done with, and we've kind of rebuilt some of it, to rebuild with people who are actually experts in their field. There's a great book by Michael Lewis, who's one of my favorite authors, called The Fifth Risk, which covers kind of what happened in the first Trump administration, which was a lot of the people who are experts under Obama. And this is not meant to be politicized. These are people who are actually like PhD level experts in their field, were replaced by people who are just not that experienced. And what I hope happens in this next 4 years is that if we do overfire and get rid of too many people, we can kind of replace them with people who we all can agree are experts without any political bend one way or the other. Now, turning to the judiciary, we do have a few, I would say, release valves in the American Constitution and the American system, which is that, for example, in the Supreme Court, and both parties have talked about this, one tactic we have is to stack the court. There's nothing that says we can only have 9 judges. We could have 11, 13, we could have 21. And that's never been used because that's been kind of like the nuclear weapon that both parties have said, if you stack the court, we're going to go all out and it's going to be nuclear war. What if we came to the table and said, we're not doing this from a political lean, but we think that the group of septuagenarians and octogenarians you have on medical life support who are making the decisions for our country could use a little bit of help from maybe, I don't know, people less than 80 years old who might know a little bit more about, let's say, the challenges we're facing with AI, the challenges we're facing with Chinese hacking of telecommunication systems, as we've seen in the last week. And so what if we did stack the court with more people who are knowledgeable on these topics? Obviously, these are not the platforms that we're running on because I don't know what the platform will be. We're going to vote on it. That's the whole beauty of it.
Right. So, so do you think that by stacking the courts, you kind of, how do you say that? You depoliticize it a bit as well? Yeah.
That, that,
Paradoxically enough, because there's a broader set of voices.
that would be an ideal outcome of some move like that, some nuclear option that we have on the books. We have it in our back pocket, but we've kind of forgotten about it because it just hasn't come up. I think as another example, most Americans probably don't know this, but we talk about the electoral college. You need 270 of the electoral votes to win the election. Almost no one, I think, in America could tell you what happens if you don't get to 270,
Right.
because we haven't even thought about what if there could be three candidates and no single candidate had the majority of the electoral college votes. Well, in that case, what happens is if you don't hit 270, it actually goes to the House of Representatives, and each state has to pick between one of the three top vote getting electoral college recipients, and each state gets one vote, and whoever gets 26 votes actually becomes the president. So there's a whole bunch of scenarios you could play with there as a third party or independent candidate, where you could wield your influence to say to either the Democrats or the Republicans, "Hey, I'm going to join with whichever party agrees to these certain demands that we have. These are the demands of the DAO, say, that you put these certain things up to a proposal, to a referendum. And if you agree to do that, we'll throw our weight with you, and we'll select the president that way." So there's all these little mechanisms that are really beautiful that 250 years ago our founding fathers kind of thought about, but which we've kind of just let gather cobwebs because we're stuck in this two-party paradigm.
Right. And states themselves have a lot of leeway in the way they kind of the way they work with their electors, right? Which
Yeah,
actual assignment they give them. So there's
exactly.
a lot of space there as well. Yeah.
There's a lot of leeway. Actually, as we saw in the last election, it could be wielded, unduly with the wrong influence, or it could be wielded properly with the mechanisms that the founding fathers thought we might end up using. They didn't know about
Right.
DAOs at the time, but I think they'd be pretty stoked to know that we're trying to use them.
All right. So I just I see that Punkar's gear is freezing up, so we'll just finish things up here. Um, Maybe he comes back. Who knows? So Josh, how do you see this moving forward? And to anyone watching at any point, yeah, what is your call to action? How do you want to create involvement within this whole movement?
Yeah, great question. For now, it's still very early days. You're very lucky if you're seeing this podcast, because I know not very many people are. But if you are watching, follow us on X, President Dow. Shoot us a direct message on there. We're looking for developers, especially people with Web3 experience. If you've been part of a DAO in the past, or you're curious, if you're an independent, if you want to see kind of the two-party paradigm upset, let us know on X, and we'd love to have you join the tent. It's going to be a big tent, and I'm very excited for the direction we're heading.
Awesome. And Josh, what will your personal role in all of this be? Are you the president of President DAO, or how does that work?
No, it is going to be as decentralized as possible. I'm only here because somebody needs to talk about it to you. We couldn't have a robot telling you about it. I don't think that would be very interesting. But I hope to take as much of a backseat as I possibly can. And you'll just have to trust me on that, I guess, because I'm a human.
True.
All right. Well,
Awesome.
yeah, thanks a lot for having me, gentlemen.
Yeah,
It's
thank you
the
for
best.
being here, Josh. And sorry for the technical
Happy.
difficulties. I think I had to drop a couple times. Need new
No
laptop.
worries. I know you're in San Francisco, the center of the technological world. Yet
Like a
somehow,
buzzer.
ironically, our politicians have not given us good Wi-Fi there.
Sounds good. I don't know if you mentioned it, but if you want to learn more about President DAO, follow President underscore DAO on X. If you want to learn more about DAOs as such, follow How to DAO book on X and pre-order our book, where it's all the basics you need to know about DAO. And if you go to actually Tele XYZ, which is one of the, I would say, top-notch DAO tooling in the space, we are running now special campaign with them, so you can get our book, their book, which goes deeper into governance, and actually free membership to How to DAO for a year for just the price of one book, $23, I believe it is. So yeah, follow us as well on Twitter. Hopefully we have some good takes. And thank you for being here with us. And we will be here also next week, where we will bring Adam from the MiDAO team, which is a team who is helping DAOs incorporate in Marshall Islands. And that will be for the first hour. But then we have Twitter Spaces also for second hour. So next week will be longer. So save your time. Kevin Owoke, the co-author of the How to DAO book, will be coming on. And the team from Common, which is a platform for programmable communities. So if you are more into, memes and vibes, that's the platform you should use for your DAO. And that's probably everything from the announcements. Thanks everyone for joining, and see you next week.
Awesome.
So long.